Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barnard. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Mika Cross. Mika is a U.S. Army veteran and a workforce futurist. In fact, she was focused on distributed team workforce requirements 2 full decades before the world went home to work in 2020. And she started working on that in the aftermath of 9/11. So, hi, Mika. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. I'm super excited about our conversation today.
Now, in my intro, I shared a little bit about your background, a little bit about how you got into some of the workforce trends that you're focused on today. But what else is it helpful for people to know about your professional journey to this point?
Well, you mentioned that I served in the United States Army, so I am a veteran, having served actually twice. I served as an enlisted soldier and also as a commissioned officer and through and after 9/11 before jumping over to become part of the civilian workforce out of uniform, working for Uncle Sam for a couple of decades all across government. But I also happen to be from a very small rural town in Maine. And so I really appreciate the importance of thinking about how strategic flexibility can impact certain demographics of workers and areas of our country all across hometown USA, who in the past, talent and people who were becoming educated would have to grow up and leave in order to find their fortune or to go to where the jobs are. And because now we're thinking more strategically, as I mentioned, about flexibility and the different kinds of structures about jobs, we can think about how employers are really able to bring access to career opportunities, employment pathways to demographics of workers that traditionally have had significant barriers to employment.
Now, that's fantastic. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you for your service. I love the fact that we have a volunteer military, that people all over the country are willing to sign up and do what is required to keep those of us on the home front safe. And it's interesting in terms of how it ties into something that many procurement professional and teams are very focused on, which is different forms of diversity. Sometimes we're looking at supplier diversity, sometimes it's workforce diversity, either in our organization or the workforces of our suppliers. And it's easy, given those conversations, to sort of lose the context that we're using diversity in each case.
Yeah.
What are some of the diverse categories of people that employers might want to know more about as they look to build out their workforce?
Yeah, really great topic of conversation, especially for industries and occupations like in acquisition and other areas that traditionally may not have had as much diverse representation of talent than we would have liked. So, we often think about increasing women and people of color, but often we don't consider diversity in terms of diversity of thought, neurodiversity, age inclusivity, when we're considering that over a quarter of our workforce are now over the age of 50. How are we going to think about attracting or keeping an aging workforce? And a lot of times it comes down to different ways of working. So people that would otherwise be retirement eligible are thinking about structuring their time in a part-time way, or job shifting, job sharing, and also, of course, remote options too. And then in terms of diversity in rural talent, these are demographics of workers that may have to reskill and upskill because of shifts in the economy and the ways that jobs are changing, from having to work from your hands in the coal mining industry or in the paper mill factories, for instance, in my hometown of Maine, to thinking about more of a knowledge work economy and how you can keep up with technology trends. And of course, I want to talk about working mothers and caregivers, because often we now are seeing workers who are in the sandwich generation, being responsible for actively parenting and also actively caregiving at the same time. And so a traditional 9 to 5, regular in office every day, 9 to 5 kind of hours may not fit for the majority of our talent any longer.
It's interesting you mentioned 9 to 5 because I was actually thinking as you were talking, 9 to 5, the movie with Dolly Parton in it, is one of my favorite movies of all time. And in fact, it's in that movie. I mean, what was that movie made in the late 70s, early 80s? I mean, it's not a new movie. They offered this very controversial idea of job sharing where you would have a working mom, you'd have two working moms basically splitting one position. One would work mornings, midday, they would swap out, the other would come in. So, some of these ideas around workforce flexibility and diversity have existed for a while. But when you layer on top of that, some of the digital advantages and capabilities we now have to bring people together, it really changes the whole situation, not just for workers, but for companies. And yet, one of the things that you and I talked about when we last connected was the danger of good intentions. And I love that idea because it's sort of, we all want to say, oh, they meant well, they have good intentions, but that there can be a danger to that. Um, what is it that you mean when you talk about the danger of good intentions? And what can companies do to keep the good intentions, but protect themselves against the associated danger?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this conversation and this dialogue around this concept because often we do go into our policy making, our creation of programs, benefits even with the best intentions in mind. But sometimes we don't consider the implications and impacts to the way that different workers experience the work environment in the
Yeah.
workplace. So, for instance, when we hope and wish to create an equitable level playing field for people, and because one demographic of worker, by virtue of their job requirements, may not be able to opt into something, say, like remote work, but another smaller segment can, sometimes we're seeing employers being overly restrictive in ways that really create harm and impact in a not so positive way
Yeah.
to attrition, engagement, productivity, and performance, because we're wanting to put an all one size fits all approach to our policies and programs in a way that just doesn't fit unique individual preferences and the way that we are able to work because we have different jobs. And so
Yeah.
thinking more broadly around how you can offer a strategic, flexible approach to all kinds of jobs, but in different ways, helps to allow choice and opt in for preference and the ability to be able to structure your work for when you can bring your best work either to a physical workplace, to your customers, to your remote home office work as well. Not all remote workers can work a 9 to 5 either because of
Yeah.
other requirements in their lives. Think about the military spouses, think about single parents, again, those individuals in sandwich generations, or people with hidden medical conditions or disabilities.
Yeah. So this is almost an opportunity for both everybody to win and also something we maybe shouldn't allow to go back to normal. For so long through COVID, we all like, oh, when are we going to return to normal? Or it's the new normal. But maybe this is an area where we should cling to some of the different approaches and methodologies that we were forced to try out during the shutdowns where people sent home, to where companies are incentivized really to look in different places and within different communities of people to fill their talent gaps, and employees, regardless of where they're located or what their personal situation might be, have an opportunity to broaden their search. um, do you find that companies and job seekers are doing an effective job of continuing to think creatively, even as things start to settle down? Or are we sort of at risk? Maybe this is another danger of good intentions. Are we maybe at risk of a little bit going too much back to the conventional way that things were before?
Look, if there's one thing we can all agree on is that change and transformation is not easy.
Yeah.
It's hard. And it also requires shifts in mindsets and different sets of skills and competencies. So if you're considering how managers and supervisors who often are already burnt out at higher rates than their non-supervisory counterparts, thinking about taking on more work with less resources, impacts to budget, and all of these uncertainties, let alone what's going on in personal lives,
Yeah.
it makes it really complex and very challenging for people to be able to lead multi-generational, mobile, modern workplaces. It's easier to put everybody in butts and seats, wherever those seats may be. It could be all
That's
remote,
right.
or it could be all in person. And so the inclination is, how quickly and fast can we get to an area where we can just keep things moving and demand more of our workers and try to have some form of accountability. But
Yeah.
I firmly believe that it's the employers that are making investments in strengthening skills, training workers at all levels how to become more efficient, how to understand how to connect with one another, because it's likely that even if you are on premise in a physically co-located area, you may not all be working together at the same exact time in the same exact place. And so these skills of empathy, leading with flexibility, understanding how to manage performance, coaching for results, and creating connections across teams are going to be the skills that all people are going to need, especially our leaders of organizations, in order to drive results in the new normal and the future of work.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because you talk about, looking at different communities of people, different locations of people to bring them in, using different forms of connectivity, and then, of course, investing in them to make sure that the company gets what they need and employees feel successful. If you have a whole series of individual managers, team leaders, coworkers that are thinking in that way, what you're actually building is company culture. It's
Yeah.
those shared values, that different mindset, the creativity that you have to bring to solve some of these talent and workforce challenges. Are there purposeful ways that company can think top down? So when we talk about, okay, let's look at creative HR people or creative hiring managers, and you sort of build that up to culture. Can you go the other way to say, this is the type of company culture or work environment we want to foster? Let's actually push that down from the top and consciously embed that in our hiring, retention, and employee development policies and standards and expectations. What would you advise from a company culture standpoint are some of the important things for people at all levels to think through?
Well, I love the top down approach to company culture, but it really takes everyone to be
Yeah.
on board in this. I mean, company culture is having a watershed moment. It's a make or break time for job seekers in terms of what they're looking for. They will choose not to accept a job or leave a job that they're actively in because of culture, i.e., toxic culture.
Yeah.
And news spreads fast. Word of mouth means more than what you advertise. It means your brand, your reputation as an employer that takes care of its people. People are willing to connect with others on social media and social networking sites to find out information. You would be surprised how many calls from people I don't even know, and they're looking for information about this employer or that employer in terms of, what does it feel like to work there?
Mm,
What does it mean to work there? So I believe that creating company culture can actually be an engagement strategy. So yes, you may want to define your values, your intent, what your desire is for this end state of your company, your organization as an employer, but inviting all voices and eyes and ears and hearts to contribute to that is a really great way to inspire trust and also open the aperture for defining your culture in different ways
yeah.
that you may not have considered before. So some of the remote first employers that we knew well before the pandemic, who have never worked together in a co-located environment, actually have so much stronger organizational culture than you could
Interesting.
ever even imagine. So I worked for one, Flex Jobs. I went before the pandemic in 2018 after 20 years of serving this country, and worked. That was my first private industry experience, working for a fully remote company, Flex Jobs. And when I tell you the way that people are connecting and feel supported, variety and choice of benefits, it is Flex Jobs. So they had a variety of flexible work options, not just remote work. And even how we define, how we decide to work
Yeah.
together, meeting time is structured. Those were investments that really played out. And working at Flex Jobs, I was able to work with employers of all sizes, types, industries, occupations, from mom and pop startups to Fortune 100 and 500, academia, nonprofit. The companies that get it right outperform their competitors, sometimes upwards of 150% when it comes to the
Wow.
line. So there are returns on investments for getting this right. And so when you're thinking about building and creating a culture, it really does take an inside out, top down, and bottom up approach, I think, to
Yeah.
create the kind of workplace. It also requires active listening and leading by example.
And I think you make great points because even if you're not purposefully investing in or crafting your company culture, you still have one. And that's kind of scary because if you allow that culture to organically build up in ways that you're not necessarily thinking through the implications of, you could be one of those employers that ends up with a reputation for a toxic culture, even though you never said, it's okay to yell at people. It's okay to belittle people. It's okay to, behave in these ways. But from a distributed standpoint, if you have sort of pressure and stress that people are acting out as they deal with their colleagues, it's actually kind of a scary idea that could build up. And as you said, go to social media before you even necessarily realize that it's a problem. Now, you're focused on tracking workforce trends, and that's part of what makes this so interesting. But for most people, managing the workforce, hiring, it's one small piece of what they do. Do you have any advice for how people who have other jobs and things that they're primarily focused on can either stay on top of some of these workplace trends that you're talking about, or try to step back and even get a little bit of an objective view of the company culture that's in place or the team culture if it's a large organization and people are working in groups? How can we make sure that that's not something that falls by the wayside and only becomes an area of the business that we put energy and effort into when there's a problem?
Yeah. I think it's a philosophy that I learned early on from the military, right? Where they really encourage you being in charge of your own career. And I sort of took that with me, both as an individual contributor, but also as a leader, as an executive in organizations, and as an advisor now strategically for other employers and the government. And so it's my opinion that leaning on the data and at least understanding the landscape of which we're working in is a piece of your job requirement, both as an employee, but also as an employer, because those workforce trends really matter. So first and foremost, I think like understanding a little bit about the data and what it looks like in your own organization is key. How many of your folks are retirement eligible? What does the average retention rates look like? And what do they look like in different categories of workers? How are women and people of color and individuals with disabilities being advanced? Are they being promoted? Are they being assessed with regards to performance evaluations and bonuses and rewarded in the same ways that others are? And what are the barriers? So can we create ways, not only through pulse surveys, engagement surveys, but also through listening sessions? And I do mean listening, not just talking.
Sitting there while somebody else talks.
Focus groups.
Yeah.
Strategic internal communications. Oh my goodness, does that harness the power of trust and transparent communication? And it matters. And then also those employee resource groups, affinity groups, those are incredibly important to be able to get to grassroots. And sometimes your labor union partners too. And you notice I said partners. And so like, how can we partner with the unions in order to, and employee representatives to get to the truth? All of those components paint the picture of what you're dealing with when you're looking to hire, when you're looking to retain, when you're promoting from within or you're not, and who you're choosing to advance and invest in. So having at least a broad understanding of those data trends are so incredibly important. And especially if you are working in human resources, if you are working in finance, where are we putting our resources? Where do we need to create strategic funding to strengthen skills and also look at succession planning for the viability and sustainability of our organizations? And are we getting return on investment? You're paying for training sometimes.
Absolutely.
Are we getting a return on investment on our learning and development training metrics? Do we know, is it a one and done, or are we continuously iterating and building that towards our culture? So there are some really strong points there. And then in terms of like broadly around the civilian labor market and what are those trends, I of course love our friends at the US Census Bureau. the Department of Labor. They have really great niche pieces. And I believe because our taxpayer dollars are funding it, we know that it's free of advertisement. At least we can
right.
on that. And so the data comes from you and I filling out our census, you and I completing our survey forms, people across hometown America and in my rural state of Maine indicating what they need, what they're doing, how they're working. Those kinds of things help inform what our labor market looks like, what the economy trends look like, and how our employers can be thinking about structuring their workforce for now, but also the future.
Because it is interesting, and this year we've had a lot of talk about AI already, right? From last year, whether generative AI or physical automation. And yet, so many companies across industries, at the end of the day, it really does come down to their humanity, how successful they are, how effectively they operate, whether they have a competitive advantage. I mean, each individual person at some point may be the face of the company that they work for. And so the associations there, the relationships, the culture, that's where all of those pieces come together and really kind of make the decision on sink or swim, right? And so taking care of people, being purposeful, and like you've said, be creative about where you go find people and the talent and skills that you bring in-house to fill those open positions.
That's right. 100%.
Now, before we wrap up our time today, we have sort of a tradition here on the Sourcing Hero that I want to bring you into. I'm going to give you 2 questions, Mika. You can pick either one, and there are no wrong answers. So here are your choices. Either what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? Or if you'd like to come at it from a little broader of a perspective, what does heroism look like in a business context?
Really good questions. I think I'll go with the heroism first. I believe that any of us can be heroes, but heroism in the workplace is being courageous, taking risks, being able to admit mistakes and learning from them, and also leading by example so that you're creating safe spaces and opportunities for others to have a voice and follow suit.
Yeah.
And you can do that from any level. It is not a requirement of a specific position grade or pay, a fancy title, whether you have a big old office in a traditional business or whether your office is a laptop like mine that you can take anywhere. And so I just firmly believe that, regardless of all of those external things, you can be a source of inspiration and heroism for others in the workplace and to pave the way by being authentic, being transparent, sticking up for what's right, and also doing your job really well.
Yeah. Now, Mika, if people have just met you through this conversation, through this podcast, and would like to reach out and connect and learn more about you and your experience and what you've talked about today, what is the best way for them to get in touch?
I'd say a couple ways if it's okay to share. First, you can go to my website. It does need to be updated, but mikacross.com. It has information about what I'm most passionate about and what I help elevate in terms of topics and themes around workplace issues. Also, LinkedIn. I am a super user on LinkedIn. I am a firm believer of social networking, and I love to connect there. So please feel free to reach out. You can find me. And also my teenage son, who is a gamer, a curious student too, but he loves the fact that you can also Google me and workplace expert. And somehow I come up with a lot of different searches and pages. So there's information on other podcasts I've done, white papers, interviews, and media, especially if you're interested around my work in the US federal government, because innovation does happen there and it still will. I'm a huge fan of public service, military service, and national service. So thank you.
Absolutely, Mika. It was an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.